Subscribe now, leave a comment if you can handle the truth, and stay with this story, because once the gates close, there's no way out. The smoke was still hanging in the air when the count came in wrong. Inside the Georgia State Prison complex, dawn should have brought routine, metal doors sliding open, guards calling numbers, inmates lining up in silence. Instead, the smell of burned plastic and sweat clung to the concrete, and alarms that had screamed through the night finally went quiet, not because the danger had passed, but because no one knew what else to do. That's when they found him. The fourth body lay in a shadowed corner of CWing, partially obscured by an overturned mattress and scattered debris. No movement. No response. A prison medic knelt beside him for less than a minute before standing up and shaking his head. 4 prisoners dead. Not during the riot. After. And that detail would change everything. Just 12 hours earlier, Georgia officials had declared the situation contained. The riot, they said, was over. Order restored. No ongoing threat. The public briefing was tight, rehearsed, and calm. But inside the prison, nothing felt calm. The riot had erupted the night before, sparked by a sudden blackout that swallowed half the facility. Power failures weren't unusual in the aging complex, but this one was different. Emergency lighting flickered instead of stabilizing. Doors that should have sealed stayed open. Radios crackled with overlapping calls that went unanswered. Inmates knew immediately. This wasn't an accident. CWing had always been volatile, overcrowded, understaffed, simmering with tension. Men packed into cells designed for half their number. Long-standing grudges. The blackout didn't create violence. It removed the last barrier holding it back. By the time response teams reached the unit, chaos had already spread. Fires burned in trash cans. Makeshift weapons clattered across the floor. Inmates moved in groups, faces half hidden, voices echoing off concrete walls. Officers pulled back. They had to. Georgia Department of Corrections policy was clear. When control is lost, you don't rush in blind. You contain. You wait. You negotiate if possible. That wait cost lives. The first death was discovered near the showers. The second in a stairwell. The third in a locked cell that hadn't been opened since the blackout began. Officials said little about how they died, only that the causes were under investigation. By morning, the warden stood before cameras and promised transparency. Then came the fourth body. And suddenly, the story no longer fit the script. Because this man wasn't found in the chaos of the riot. He was found after lockdown had been re-established. After doors were secured. After counts were supposedly accurate. Which raised a terrifying question. How did someone die when the prison was already back under control? Investigators from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation arrived within hours. They walked the scorched corridors, stepping over ash and broken plastic, documenting everything. They spoke to guards who hadn't slept. To inmates who refused to talk. To administrators who swore procedures had been followed. But procedure didn't explain the gaps. CWing's security logs showed inconsistencies, timestamps that didn't line up, doors registering closed when witnesses said they were open, radio transmissions logged but never heard. Someone had lost control of the system. Or someone had exploited it. The fourth prisoner's name wasn't released immediately. Officials said they were notifying next of kin. But within the prison, his identity spread fast. He wasn't a gang leader. Wasn't known as a troublemaker. He'd kept his head down, served his time quietly, worked kitchen detail. The kind of inmate who survives by staying invisible. Which made his death even more unsettling. Because invisible men don't usually die last. In the days leading up to the riot, tension had been building, not just among inmates, but among staff. Mandatory overtime. Staffing shortages. Equipment failures that went unaddressed. Officers working double shifts with little support. One guard, speaking later under condition of anonymity, described the feeling as standing on a fault line. Everyone knew something was coming, he said. We just didn't know when. The blackout was the match. But investigators were starting to believe the riot itself wasn't the whole fire. Witness accounts, fragmented, fearful, hinted at something more organized beneath the chaos. Certain doors opened while others stayed locked. Some inmates moved freely while others were trapped. There were reports of orders being given, not shouted, but passed quietly, hand to hand. Not random violence. Directed violence. The fourth death sharpened those suspicions. Medical examiners noted signs that suggested the man had been alive well after the riot officially ended. That meant someone had access to him during lockdown. Someone who could move, unseen, through a prison that was supposed to be sealed tight. That narrowed the list dramatically. Inside the administration building, tension boiled over. Meetings stretched late into the night. Finger-pointing began. Was it a staffing failure? A systems failure? Or something far worse? Publicly, officials urged patience. Privately, they feared exposure. Families of inmates gathered outside the prison gates, demanding answers. News vans lined the road. Helicopters circled overhead. The story spread fast. 4 dead in a Georgia prison riot, questions swirling, officials silent. And then a guard didn't show up for his shift. At first, it was written off as exhaustion. It happened. But when supervisors tried to reach him and failed, concern grew. His last radio transmission, logged during the riot, was brief and strange. All secure, he'd said. But nothing had been secure. When investigators reviewed footage from his assigned corridor, they noticed something chilling. During the final hours of the lockdown, the camera covering the section where the 4th prisoner was later found went dark for exactly 7 minutes. No alert. No maintenance log. Just darkness. 7 minutes was more than enough time. As the investigation deepened, a pattern began to form, one that suggested the riot had provided cover, not cause. Cover for settling scores. Cover for silencing someone. Cover for something that had nothing to do with power outages or overcrowding. The 4th prisoner hadn't been caught in the riot. He'd been targeted by it. Late that night, a sealed report crossed the warden's desk. Inside were preliminary findings, witness statements, and a single still image pulled from security footage just before the camera cut out. It showed a figure standing outside a cell door. The image was grainy, the face unclear, but the uniform was unmistakable. When they enhanced the photo, zooming in on the badge, the room went silent. Because if the image was authentic, it meant the most dangerous person during the Georgia prison riot hadn't been an inmate at all. And if that was true, then the 4th death wasn't the end of the violence. It was the beginning of something much worse. The sun had barely broken over the sprawling prison complex when the investigation shifted into high gear. Teams from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, corrections auditors, and forensic specialists descended like a swarm, combing through charred cell blocks, hallways blackened with smoke, and shattered surveillance equipment. Every step, every footprint, every discarded piece of metal could hold the key to what really happened during the riot, and more importantly, during those final 7 minutes. Investigators soon realized that the chaos had masked a precision that no riot should possess. Fires were set, yes, but only in specific areas that drew attention away from the corridors where the most dangerous activity occurred. Doors had been barricaded selectively, leaving access to certain wings entirely unmonitored. It was as if someone had orchestrated the disorder with intimate knowledge of the prison's vulnerabilities. Interviews with surviving inmates painted a terrifying picture. Whispers of "he moves like a shadow" or "you don't see him coming" kept surfacing. One inmate, shaking and wrapped in a threadbare blanket, described the 4th prisoner's final hours. He hadn't fought, hadn't made noise. He had been pulled into a side corridor by someone wearing a uniform, someone whom the prisoners initially assumed was an officer. His voice trembled as he recalled, "It wasn't a man, it was authority, but the way he moved, it wasn't like any guard I've ever seen." This set off alarm bells. Investigators began to suspect that at least one individual, either a rogue officer, a corrupt staff member, or someone masquerading as personnel, had used the riot as cover to execute a precise, targeted killing. The inmate's death was not random. It was deliberate, calculated, and terrifying in its efficiency. Meanwhile, the prison administration was in chaos. Public relations teams scrambled to craft statements about unforeseen events and continued investigations, while internal memos revealed frustration and fear. A private, off-the-record conversation with one senior officer revealed how vulnerable the system had become. "We thought we were prepared. We're not. No one's really prepared for someone like him, someone who knows the walls, the locks, and the weaknesses better than we do." The forensic team moved in next. Each death had been examined meticulously. The first 3 were violent, typical of riot-related incidents, blunt force trauma, stabbings with improvised weapons. The 4th, however, was different. The autopsy revealed signs that pointed to asphyxiation under controlled circumstances, combined with blunt trauma that could not have been inflicted in the chaos of a riot. Someone had approached him, subdued him, and executed a silent plan while the rest of the prison remained in controlled lockdown. It was enough to make seasoned investigators uneasy. The thought that a prisoner, or anyone, could manipulate the prison environment so precisely, undetected, was unprecedented. Weeks passed, and the story grew even darker. Security footage, once enhanced, revealed fleeting shadows of movement in areas that should have been locked tight. Objects, keys, tools, even certain personal effects, had gone missing. Items that, in theory, could have prevented these deaths were nowhere to be found. Detectives began to assemble a profile. The figure in the uniform was methodical, calm, and experienced. They had to understand the prisoner's psychology to anticipate the next move. They interviewed psychologists, former correctional officers, and criminologists. Every expert came to the same chilling conclusion: this wasn't the act of an impulsive inmate. It was the work of someone trained, someone familiar with the machinery of confinement, someone willing to exploit fear as a weapon. By the 3rd week, rumors began circulating in media outlets and online forums. 4th prisoner dies after Georgia prison riot became a trending headline across the nation. People speculated wildly: insider corruption, gang executions, hidden conspiracies. Families of victims demanded answers. Politicians called for hearings. Social media buzzed with fear and outrage. Inside the prison, however, the tension was palpable. Surviving inmates whispered about him, the invisible force who had controlled the chaos. Officers patrolling the halls noticed unease unlike anything they had experienced in decades. Panic flared silently, eyes darted constantly, hands stayed on keys and cuffs, and every door, every corner, was treated as potentially lethal. Then came the next shocking development. During a routine sweep of the surveillance room, IT specialists discovered tampering. Logs had been edited. Hours of footage during the blackout were missing entirely, replaced with repeated sequences from earlier in the day. Whoever had orchestrated the deaths had covered their tracks meticulously. This was no longer a riot gone wrong. It was a calculated operation that leveraged confusion and institutional flaws. Detectives dug deeper into staffing patterns. One officer's schedule seemed off. There were inconsistencies in badge scans and access logs. Anonymous tips suggested that someone inside the administration may have been complicit or, at the very least, negligent. Investigators faced the unnerving possibility that the prisoner had allies, or informants, within the very system designed to contain him. Meanwhile, inside CWing, survivors told new stories. One inmate described hearing muffled voices in the darkness, planning movements, and a strange calm in the chaos. The rioters, he said, were reacting as expected, but the 4th prisoner? He had been moved like a chess piece, positioned, controlled, unseen until it was too late. By now, the investigation had expanded beyond Georgia State Prison. Federal authorities were called in to examine potential breaches in protocol and systemic failures. Whistleblowers from other correctional facilities weighed in, describing how similar perfect storms could be engineered. Analysts compared it to military infiltration tactics: precise, calculated, lethal. And then, the ultimate discovery: a hidden corridor, a maintenance access tunnel that had been overlooked for decades. It ran parallel to the main cell blocks, allowed movement without triggering alarms, and provided line of sight into CWing. Investigators speculated this was the pathway used to access the 4th prisoner without detection. The revelation sent shockwaves. Not only had the prisoner, or an accomplice, manipulated a riot to commit murder, but they had also exploited structural weaknesses unknown to nearly everyone in the facility. At the same time, the GBI discovered what they called the ghost list. Names of prisoners who should have been in cells during the riot didn't appear in logs. Items that had been issued to officers were unaccounted for. A methodical, almost ritualistic pattern emerged, pointing to a level of organization that few could comprehend. Investigators began to fear the unimaginable. The fourth prisoner's death might only be the tip of the iceberg. Someone, or something, was orchestrating events inside Georgia State Prison with a precision that challenged reality. And then, late one night, a second body was discovered, not an inmate this time. A corrections officer. In the same wing. Under similar conditions. No struggle. No chaos. Just dead. The investigators knew the stakes had escalated. Whoever had killed the fourth prisoner was still active. Still inside. And no one was safe. As the chapter closes, the question looms over Georgia State Prison. Was the fourth prisoner the target, or the warning? By now, the prison was a fortress under investigation. Federal and state authorities had taken over security, forensic, and administrative oversight. Every cell, hallway, and maintenance corridor was mapped, scanned, and analyzed. But even as experts combed through evidence, the atmosphere inside CWing remained tense, suffocating. Guards didn't relax. Inmates didn't sleep. Fear had become a permanent resident. The fourth prisoner's death had already shaken the prison to its core. Now, with the killing of the corrections officer, it became clear this was not a riot. Not even a mutiny. This was something far more insidious. A predator, invisible and lethal, had infiltrated the very system meant to control him. Investigators returned repeatedly to the maintenance tunnels. Measurements were taken, access points cross-referenced, and security cameras rechecked. What they discovered next was staggering. A series of hidden passageways and overlooked stairwells allowed rapid movement across wings without triggering alarms. These weren't on official blueprints. They were remnants of an older facility layout, forgotten during decades of renovations, but they were enough to give someone near-complete freedom inside the prison. Forensic teams began piecing together the timeline. The fourth prisoner had been isolated intentionally. The officer had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Every move appeared carefully choreographed, as if rehearsed by someone who knew not just the building, but the human behavior within it, intimately. One breakthrough came when investigators reviewed the enhanced surveillance from the day of the riot. They noticed subtle patterns in the shadows, figures moving against the grain of chaos, bypassing crowds, disappearing and reappearing in ways that no ordinary inmate could manage. One shadow, in particular, lingered near key points just before the deaths occurred. Its gait, its posture, its calculated pauses suggested training, discipline, and cold intelligence. Interviews with surviving inmates now took on a new tone. Whispers of, "He walks like he owns the place," and "You don't see him, but he sees everything," echoed through CWing. One long-term prisoner finally revealed what he had suspected all along. He wasn't one of us. Not really. He moved like someone who had done this before, someone who could make a riot his weapon. The hunt zeroed in on a prime suspect, a prisoner who had been transferred into CWing months earlier, ostensibly for low-risk housing. Quite unassuming. But a review of his record revealed something that hadn't been publicized. Extensive military training, specialized security clearance, and experience in tactical operations. Skills that could turn confusion into control, fear into leverage. Authorities intensified surveillance, tracking every movement, interviewing every staff member who had interacted with him. They discovered that this prisoner had exploited minor oversights for months, doors propped open by maintenance errors, cameras with intermittent failures, and officers stretched thin. The riot wasn't a spontaneous outbreak. It had been bait, designed to create predictable chaos while the operative moved unseen. The final revelation came when investigators accessed a set of encrypted messages found on contraband cell phones. The messages were sparse but chilling, indicating awareness of timing, rotation, and surveillance patterns. They confirmed what forensic analysis had suggested. The fourth prisoner had been targeted. He had known too much, or been in the wrong place at the wrong time. And the officer's death was an extension of that control, a warning to anyone who might interfere. When confronted, the operative showed no remorse. Composed. Detached. His confession, when it came, was eerily matter-of-fact. He described manipulating the riot, the deaths, and the chaos as a test, not just of the prison system, but of human behavior. "You think prisons contain people," he said. "I contain the prison." The fallout was immediate. Georgia State Prison faced federal oversight, staff were reassigned, and the prison layout was redesigned to eliminate the hidden corridors. Policies were rewritten. Training programs overhauled. But the psychological scar remained. Inmates who had survived the riot carried permanent fear. Officers questioned their ability to maintain control. Administrators learned firsthand that no system is infallible. As for the operative, he was transferred to a supermax facility, isolated from the general population, where surveillance was constant and movement restricted. Yet even there, investigators couldn't shake the realization that his mind had been the deadliest weapon of all. One expert described it as a storm contained only by walls, not by morality or restraint. In the aftermath, families of the victims struggled to find closure. The fourth prisoner's death had become emblematic of the system's failures. The officer's killing forced a reckoning within law enforcement and corrections. And for the nation, the story served as a stark reminder, even in places designed for maximum security, one individual, highly trained and determined, can bend the rules of chaos to lethal effect. The Georgia prison riot was over. The bodies had been counted. Investigators had answers, but the fear lingered. Inmates and officers alike whispered in hallways about the operative who moved like a shadow, controlled chaos, and struck with precision. And somewhere, deep inside the prison, he sat in his solitary cell, the embodiment of a terrifying truth. Prison may hold men, but some men can hold the prison. The story closed not with a riot, but with a haunting silence, the silence of control, of mastery, and of a predator who had turned confinement into a weapon. If you thought this story was intense, you're not ready for the next one. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it.